Welcome to the Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and tonight my guest is Dr. Dale Allison, a professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. We're going to be discussing his new book on the resurrection of Jesus. It's called The Resurrection of Jesus, Apologetics, Polemics, History. Thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Allison.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
The book is divided into 4 parts, and my goal is to hit some of the highlights in each part. It's a thick book. We can't discuss it all, but some of the important parts that stuck out to me, I want to discuss with you. So first, let me ask, how did you become interested in this topic, and what led you to write this book?
So I think it's fair to say that I've been interested in this subject for over 45 years. So this book actually goes back to when I was a teenager. I remember my final year of high school reading some of the books on the resurrection from the first part of the 20th century, books by people such as James Orr or W.J. Sparrow Simpson. Anyway, I was rooting for these books, but they didn't stand up, in my judgment, to critical scrutiny. And the next major thing I think about is when I was in college, my second year or my third year, and I read Wolfhart Pannenberg's famous Christology, which was written in the 1960s. And he has a very famous section within it in which he argues that that belief in the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation for the data that we have. And I remember reading that for the first time and putting it down and wondering what the heck just happened. Did he really do what he said he did? Is that really possible? If not, what are the problems here? I didn't see the problems the first time I read it. So anyway, that subject has been with me for a long time. And during my doctoral work, I ended up in my dissertation adding a little appendix on this issue of where belief in Jesus' resurrection came from. In the published book, it's only 5 or 6 pages long, so that was extremely frustrating to me. And in 2005, I was finally able to turn to that subject at great length, and I published a book called Resurrecting Jesus. It's not all about the resurrection, but there's one chapter in it that's 150 pages long, and that's where the book gets its title from. And then, of course, there were lots of responses to this long chapter, and then ever since, I've been thinking about the topic and learned new things. And I finally decided a few years ago I had to return to the subject. So I ended up writing this book, which really does sort of bring to a conclusion thoughts I've been pondering since the 1970s, since I was a teenager. So it's fair to say this book is over 45 years in the making, probably closer to 50 years in the making. And as you said, it's a really big book. And it's bigger than it's actually bigger than it looks, because the print is small, too small for me. I don't like it. But it's also got footnotes, and the print's even smaller in them. So it's a long book, but that's where it comes from.
Two follow-up thoughts there. One is, somebody that's read Resurrecting Jesus may wonder, so why do I need this book? If I read, 150 pages of Dr. Allison's thoughts before this, what would you say to them?
I'd say half the book is completely new, and everything that is taken from the previous book is thoroughly revised. I don't think there are any paragraphs that are the same in each book. There are also things in the first book I've changed my mind about, and they're just gone. Some of the arguments I used before, I've revised and reconsidered, decided I might have been wrong about them. So it's not just the expansion of the previous work. It has lots of things that aren't in the other book.
Excellent. And the follow-up thought was just, thank you for all those years of studying this topic and putting it in. And I think I recall you saying this near the beginning of the book, that you said, I still didn't finish the book that I set out to.
No, no, no. So this is a subject that's almost infinite. And so when I was done, I didn't feel that I had really finished the book. I just thought I have to quit because this will just go on forever. So, um, no, I'm not done personally, by the way. I will continue to read and to think and to ponder. But I'm guessing this is the last book I'll write on this subject. I don't think anybody else needs to hear from me again. But I, for me, this is a time pursuit, and it's something that I can't let go of, and that doesn't let go of me.
This first section of the book you call setting the stage, and I found this really helpful, this section. You say that there's, generally speaking, 9 categories of explanations for the Easter faith. So can you tell us what these 9 categories are? And I'll have you elaborate on some of the more interesting ones.
Okay, so I knew you were going to ask that question, and I knew I couldn't keep 9 of them in my head. So I actually wrote them down here. So let me just go through them too briefly, and then you can ask for clarification. All right. So the first one is the obvious explanation. It's the traditional explanation. God raised Jesus from the dead, and that's what explains this belief, and that's what explains the data. And of course, that works. The second option is that the grave was emptied through non-supernatural means. Maybe Joseph of Arimathea took the body after he put it in for some reason or another, or maybe the body was stolen by thieves. Anyway, you can get the tomb empty without invoking God. So some people say, okay, that's what happened here. The tomb was emptied, and then that led to everything that came after. The third option is that Jesus never died. This is not an option that I think you should take seriously, or anybody else at this point in history. But even today, every few years, you'll get a popular potboiler which will argue that Jesus and Joseph of Arimathea were in on the plot, or Jesus and Pilate, and Jesus was drugged to make it look like he died, but he didn't really die. And you get all sorts of weird things. So nobody should take that seriously. I don't know of any modern scholars who take it seriously. The fourth option is one that I think most skeptics in our time and place hold to, and this is the view that everything got started with hallucinations. So we know people see things all the time, invisible things, and none of us thinks that everything that people see or think they see is genuinely there. So we use the word hallucination in a derogatory sense. People see what is not there. So this option says that everything got started when people thought that they saw Jesus after his crucifixion. The fifth option is duplicity. Now, again, not many people hold this, but it had a bit of a run in the 18th century during a very anti-clerical period. And the idea was that the disciples had followed Jesus around, and people gave them food and looked up to them. And when Jesus died, they thought, we're out of business. How can we keep this going? It's a good thing. And they decided, well, we'll just make up stories about the resurrection, and then we can stay in the religion business. So a very, very cynical take. And I actually don't know anyone who holds this today. The sixth option is the notion of veridical vision or veridical visions. So what this means is that the disciples saw Jesus, they really saw him, but the tomb wasn't empty. So this probably strikes most traditional Christians as odd, but this has been a view that's been propounded by German theologians in the 19th and 20th century. And it's the view that Jesus did survive death. He did reveal himself to his followers, but the story of the empty tomb is secondary. It's a legend. It was created after they came to believe on the basis of these authentic revelatory experiences. The seventh is harder to explain. This is pre-Easter expectations. And this is the notion that the disciples already beforehand had certain expectations of Jesus rising from the dead. And so when he died, they simply assumed that he had risen from the dead because that's what they were already expecting before the fact. The eighth view is the mythological view. And that's the easiest view. I think it's also the least plausible of all of these. It's the view that Jesus didn't exist, so we're simply dealing with mythology. Jesus himself is a myth. The stories are myth. That's it. None of it ever happened. Let's just explain it that way, the way we do stories of Greek gods, for example. The final point of view is just where I lump together really idiosyncratic views. And my favorite idiosyncratic view was actually put forward by a Roman Catholic priest, not, I don't know, three or four decades ago. And this is a priest who believes in the afterlife and believes that Jesus conquered death, but he doesn't believe in physical resurrection. And so what he posits is God had to convince the disciples that Jesus lived, but they were stuck in physical resurrection. And so what God did is he just made the body disintegrate really rapidly. The processes were all natural. It's just the speeded up process, right? Just it took place very quickly, 24 hours or so. And then the tomb was empty, and that freed the disciples to be able to understand the visions and the encounters that were granted to them post Easter. So very quickly, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
I want to come back to a couple of them because there were a few that I found really interesting. So something about the empty tomb explanation where it gets empty without there being a miracle. There was an interesting line in the book where you said that a friend, I forgot your friend's name, had directed you to some data showing that there was an earthquake at the time of roughly at this time, and so there could have been an earthquake that opened up the tomb and then slammed back, and so it looks like the body's been gone, and maybe even something like earth shaking happened.
Yeah, so literally earth shaking. So yeah, I had lunch with a geologist one day who wanted to talk to me about a New Testament scholar, and he'd been doing some work in the Holy Land and had discovered, he thought, that if you interpreted the strata correctly, there had in fact been an earthquake right around the year AD 33, right? So, okay, Matthew says there was an earthquake. But I found two German theologians who seriously proposed that there was an earthquake, the body just slipped into the cracks, and that's how you get started. So you can get the idea from what I've said already that there are all sorts of really exotic alternatives to the traditional explanation. And if you can get used to, if I may put it this way, if you can get used to the blasphemy, some of them are entertaining. You just have to admire them for their imaginations, even if you don't think there's any truth there at all.
Another one about hallucinations. So one thing I guess I wanted to ask you about this is, do you find that among scholars who propose hallucinations as the explanation, do they want to appeal to groups of people having hallucinations, or more often is it that there were one or two or a few individuals that had these hallucinations, and then I guess through some other process, not hallucinations, it spread?
Yeah. So yeah, most of them would say maybe Mary Magdalene hallucinated Jesus, and then maybe Peter hallucinated Jesus, and Paul, maybe they speculated an epileptic, and so he had an epileptic seizure on the Damascus Road, and that's why he saw Jesus. So you have a series of hallucinations. And then the problem, of course, becomes collective stories, and it's much harder to find examples of collective hallucinations, right? Or things that people think of as hallucinations. But if you search hard enough, you can find weird accounts of people claiming several people at once seeing strange things. I discuss some of these in the book. I find them interesting, and some of them quite puzzling. But this view, yes, has it that I think Bart Ehrman belongs here, that you have some disciples who see Jesus, And then the stories come later, the story of the empty tomb and the rest of it. So yeah, and that's a very common view if you're not taking the traditional Christian approach to this.
And the difference here between hallucinations and then veridical visions is, with hallucinations, there's not really something outside your mind there that you are perceiving. But with veridical visions, there really is something outside your mind that you are perceiving, right?
Yeah, so if you go back to Ponnenberg thinks the tomb was empty, but he thinks the stories in the Gospels are not historical. So he thinks that the disciples are having visionary experiences, but he believes in the truth of some visions, right? So, by the way, that's my own view. I think you'd be a fool to believe that all visions that people have are veridical. But I also am of the view that sometimes people see things that are manifesting themselves. And so that's where the idea of a veridical vision comes from. And by the way, I should just add as a sort of a footnote, people who believe in veridical visions don't just say, well, I believe in veridical visions. What they'll say is, look at the stories. And so they'll tell stories like this, and there are multitudes of these sorts of stories. They'll say somebody is sitting in a chair, and then they have a vision, and it's a vision of, let's say, this woman's brother, and he's dying, and he's been shot, and then the vision just fades. And of course, the punchline is that 3 days from after that, this person gets a notice that at that time this person was dying. So if you can compile enough stories like this, and in my view, they have compiled enough stories like this, that I sometimes think that people are, if you want to use the word hallucinating, they're hallucinating in response to incoming input, however it is getting there.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's fine for now. So those are some possible explanations, and that kind of finished the first part of the book, setting the stage. But then in part 2, you say that the historian's task is to determine, if possible, which of those solutions is the right one, or at least which one best fits the evidence. So for this, you turn to historical critical studies, and there are actually several chapters in this section, and I'm just going to single out one of them that I thought has big implications. So what is your view on Matthew 27, 51 to 53, and what are the big implications of this view?
Okay, well, first of all, we should elaborate for your viewers that Matthew 27, 51 through 53 is the story of an earthquake, rocks being rent, tombs opening, and then many, many saints getting up. And after his resurrection, after Jesus's resurrection, going into Jerusalem and appearing to many. It is a strange story. Many people have said it's the strangest story in the New Testament, or even it's the strangest story in the Bible. Now, I think it's important. Most books on the resurrection sort of treat this in passing or just ignore it altogether because it occurs only in Matthew. And a lot of historical critical scholars just assume that it's late and that it's a legend, and they don't pay it any attention. I think it deserves a lot of attention. So several years ago, Tom Wright, in his big book on the resurrection, discusses it, and he comes to no clear conclusion. But he says in passing, some things are so odd that maybe they just happened. Now, I regard this as a fairly flimsy defense of the historicity of this, because oddness usually, more often than not, implies or suggests fiction. But in any case, I think this did not happen. And here I push the argument from silence. Arguments from silence can be dangerous, but in this case, I think it's hard to ignore. This occurs only in one source, which was written over 50 years after the event. And you would think if lots of people rose, it says many, poloi, if many people rose from the dead, exited their tombs, walked into Jerusalem and talked about things, that this would be a big deal. It would probably be the foundation of early Christian apologetics. Everybody saw all these people. So it's not there, just in Matthew. So then the question becomes, what do you make of it? Now, the very interesting phenomenon that has taken place in the last several decades, and it is that evangelicals look at this passage and they say, well, it's not intended to be taken literally. It's like the parables of Jesus. A sower went out to sow, and so on. It's a way of decorating the story theologically and making a theological point. So Mike Licona argues this, Michael Bird argues this, Don Hagner in his commentary argues this. There's a whole line of very evangelical conservative people who say this, and then they appeal to the fact that in Greco-Roman sources you can find a lot of people whose deaths are associated with signs and wonders, important people. Same thing in the rabbis. So they say it's a literary motif, and everybody would have understood this. So I agree with them. I don't think this happened. The problem is, I don't think it's a literary motif. I think Matthew's gospel implies that it happened. I don't think Matthew does anything to distinguish this passage from the surrounding material. Actually inserted into it is this happened after his resurrection, as though somebody's really concerned about chronology. I find no evidence that anyone in the early church ever allegorized this completely, or even Origen thinks it happens. Origen's the great allegorist who likes to read things figuratively. He thinks it happened literally. I don't think it's until recent times that you get people saying this is just a parable. So I go on and give my reasons for thinking that this didn't happen, but Matthew thought it did. And that's the important point. Because, look, I say on the very first page, I think that I'm going to go to church next Easter, and I think Jesus saw the disciples and they saw him. But I try to see things from both sides, and I want to be honest, and I don't want to be an apologist. I want to convince myself. And so here's a fact that I think it should be welcome to skeptics, and that apologists should be unhappy with, because it looks to me like you have a first century source which contains a story about empty tombs and appearances that is not history, but it's been taken to be history. So I view it as something like, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Seven Sleepers of Ephesus, but it's a Christian legend. It's a story about 7 people who fell asleep in a cave, and they fell asleep during a time of persecution, but they wake up after the empire has become Christian. It's an early version of Rip Van Winkle. Okay?
Yeah.
But all historians think it's a legend. But the thing is that it was received soon enough as history. And you can actually go to Ephesus today, and they show you the cave where it happened, and there are tourists, tourists and people selling T-shirts and all of this. The point is that you can have things that start out as stories and then quickly get interpreted as history. And my argument is that you have this clearly, at least in one place, in Matthew, and it's in Matthew's passion and resurrection narrative. So that should give you a word of caution. Okay, so that's why it's important to me.
So it looks like there was a story about people coming out of empty tombs in a source about an individual, Jesus namely, coming out of an empty tomb 3 days later. But in the case of these holy ones, these saints, it looks like this is legendary. And that should give one pause about the rest of the story that what looks like a legend is inserted into.
It's got to raise questions for you. And by the way, I do make an attempt to try to understand where the story came from, and I don't succeed. I can conceive of this starting as a vision. Maybe somebody saw some empty tombs around Jerusalem and thought this was the best explanation. Maybe somebody saw some fissures, some cracks in the rocks, and knew there was an earthquake around the time of Jesus. And I don't know how this got started. I just don't think it's an historical report, and that's my point in that chapter. And that's why the rest of the book is as it is. That is, everything is open to question for me. I'm trying to be an historian, and I'm trying to be critical despite my own predispositions.
Yeah, that's something I appreciate about your work so much, is you are very honest, and that's a breath of fresh air. I really appreciate that. So, okay, that was just one of the chapters in the second section of the book on historical critical studies. You have other chapters on the empty tomb, but I'm not going to go into that just for the sake of time. So the third section of the book is called Thinking with Parallels. And you begin this section by explaining how you treat parallels between Jesus' resurrection and other phenomena differently than the way that the apologist and the skeptic would. So, can you explain how you treat those parallels differently?
All right. So it's not just those parallels differently, but I try to I have parallels of my own that I think I've discovered and discussed. So the typical skeptical argument would be like this: I found some other stories of empty tombs, and I know they are all legendary. Therefore, that's reason for thinking that Jesus' story is legendary. Or I know lots of people who think they see things, think they see dead loved ones, but they don't. So that ups the odds that that Jesus didn't appear to his disciples. So the point is to compile parallels in order to prove that the traditional Christian count is false. And what apologists tend to do with parallels is bat them away. That is, argue that, well, they're not really that close, or they're not really that important, or they're not really parallels. So you see people parading parallels to promote the skeptical point of view, and people promoting or attacking parallels to make the resurrection of Jesus totally unique. And what I do with the parallels is I'm not there to using them for the apologist's reason or for the skeptic's reason. I'm putting them together to see what I can learn. So one of the chapters in there that I expect will get some attention is a chapter I really don't know what to do with. But for a long time, I knew one story about a Tibetan master saint, Buddhist saint, from the 1950s, who supposedly, after he died, was put in a little closet. And then several days later, they opened it up, and all that was left were some fingernails and, his hair. Okay. What I discovered after that, and this is not in any of the secondary literature, we've just missed it in the West, we've completely missed it, is that there is an ongoing tradition in Tibetan Buddhism of masters who, at the end of their lives, disappear, disintegrate. Now, by the way, this is really weird, because the idea is that they shrink into nothingness, but some of them only shrink halfway. They don't complete the process. And the strangest thing is there are pictures of these on the internet of these shrunken little people. Now, these stories are ongoing. That is, one happened in the 1990s, one happened since then. I've learned that Tibetans don't think these are just fairy tales or stories. The Dalai Lama knew the people involved in one of these stories, and the Dalai Lama says he believes them. The Dalai Lama, by the way, is not a naive miracle monger. If you read his stuff, he knows about modern science, and he knows about Western skepticism and so on. But in this case, he said, yeah, I know the people involved. I think this happened. So I in this chapter compile all these stories, or at least refer to as many as I could find, and there are dozens. And then I simply said, I don't know what to make of this, but let's just think about it. If these stories are not true, what would that mean? What would it say about how rumors and legends and misperception can lead to stories in which bodies disappear? On the other hand, on the other hand, what if some of these are true? What the heck would that mean? What would Christian theologians have to do with it? And so I followed both paths, and I didn't conclude anything at the end of the day. I just said, look at these. These are parallels of a sort. Aren't they really interesting? And if we could figure out what was going on one way or the other, I would think there would be lessons here for us. All right. So that's what I did with that. I also have a chapter on a famous series of apparitions of Mary in Zaytun, Egypt, which is a suburb of Cairo, which took place in the late 60s. I think this is an astounding event. I don't know what to make of it, but Coptic Christians, Egyptian Orthodox Christians, think that Mary appeared. And if you read the sources, the news reports from the time, stories from Islamic observers, church observers, people in the streets, police, secular journalists, something was on the dome of this church off and on for months. And the crowds were in the tens of thousands. It's a really fascinating story. The skeptics thought, well, maybe it's some electrical trick. The local government actually unplugged the whole electric grid in the area, and the light still showed up. Anyway, my point here is that we know a lot about this. We know a lot about it. And I don't know what the skeptical explanation is. I know what some skeptics have said. I find none of it plausible. The Coptic Christians say it must have been Mary. I'm just sitting here left scratching my head. What the heck is this? Maybe the world is just a very strange place, or maybe there's something wrong with my theology, and I should be able to say, well, this must be Mary, but for some reason I can't do it. But again, I tried to draw out the parallels here. It's very interesting. I'm a skeptic and not a skeptic. I'm not a skeptic because I know this happened, and I don't buy any of the reductionistic explanations. On the other hand, in this case, I'm not really willing to jump on board and say, well, this must be Mary. I just think this is something we know not what. And we always assume that if we could go back in time, we'd figure everything else. We'd figure everything out. Maybe if we went back to the appearance of the 500, we still couldn't figure out anything. I don't know. But that's a parallel I had fun pursuing. I spent a lot of time looking at visions of recently departed people. And this is something that's been studied a lot the last few decades. We now know it's extremely common for people to see dead ones a few days, especially within the first week of their departure. So what do you do with all this literature? Is it relevant? I actually end up arguing. I guess at the end of the day, I'm back with Pannenberg, whom I read in college. I think the tomb was empty, but I think that there are enough parallels here between what I see in the Gospels and what I see elsewhere to think that these are visionary experiences. Now, an evangelical would say, but you have to throw away the passages in Luke and John where Jesus is touched or he's eating, right? Okay. Well, given who I am, given my training and my view of things, that doesn't bother me so much, all right? But I think that some of these appearances are veridical. By the way, I do discuss in the book my own encounter with a dead friend on the third day after she had died. I did see a friend who woke me up in the night and appeared at the foot of my bed. And it's really, really hard for me to think I was just hallucinating. It just seemed real. And I have stories from my wife and all three of my children about their encounters with dead people. So I've got a lot of firsthand accounts around here, as well as the literature. And so that's influenced me a lot. You know, you read yourself into text, but I think these parallels really do have to be taken seriously. And I don't think apologists have satisfactorily explained them away yet. Most of the modern apologists want to say that when Jesus rose from the dead, he was physically there, physically there. Most of them I do not think are like John Calvin. John Calvin actually said that in the Gospel of John, when Jesus appears in the room and then disappears, he must have gone in and out the door. Calvin wanted Jesus's body to be really there. I think most of the modern apologists think that the physical body could pop in and out, right? So that's a bit different than Calvin. I think you can be real and not be physical in our sense. Anyway, that's one of the things I do in that section. And another thing I do is I look at appearances of Jesus down through history, and I think we need to pay more attention to these. So in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, well, Jesus appeared to Peter, the 12, the 500, James, the apostles, and then to me. But if you read the New Testament, you know, he also appeared to Stephen, who, by the way, isn't on that list of in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul could add himself, even though his experience was later and different than the others, maybe. Why doesn't he add Stephen? Interesting question. We also know John, the son of Zebedee, saw, or whoever he is, John the Revelator, traditionally identified with John, the son of Zebedee, in the book of Revelation, sees Jesus in the very first chapter. But we know all sorts of people down through history have seen Jesus. I've known a couple of people who told me that they saw Jesus. So here's the thing for me. I think it would be really odd to say that every appearance of Jesus down through history is a hallucination, a subjective nothing. But we know that the first appearances to Jesus in the New Testament were real. In the book, I argue that this is a bit odd and that I'm uncomfortable with it. And I think that if, like me, you want to hold that some of these appearances in New Testament times were veridical or real, you should be really open to the possibility of some of these later ones also. I know many stuffy mainline churchgoers who think that's crazy, but I think it's a bit odd to explain away one pile of data and then to accept completely another set of data, even though there are interesting parallels between them. So I've tried to underline those parallels and then query the apologists who frequently go back to Acts 1, where Jesus quits appearing after 40 days, but he doesn't quit appearing after 40 days. He shows up several more times in the book of Acts. So how do you understand this? What's going on? And so on. So that's what I'm doing there. I'm looking at a bunch of parallels and just trying to figure out what they might mean, not playing the apologist, not playing the skeptic.
Okay, that was a lot of information. I'm glad you ran through those. So we've got rainbow body, where it's up, the person can choose which route they want to take that. Do they want to say the accounts of rainbow body are just made up in some sense, they're legend? If so, then it looks like a lesson. That's what I was going to ask you next. I'm leading there. Well, let me do these one at a time. In terms of a lesson that we can take away from rainbow bodies, what would be the lesson?
Well, I would say if you're a skeptic and think this is all baloney, it's more reason for thinking that the early Christian stuff is baloney. If you are an apologist, you need to ask whether the arguments you are using for Jesus's resurrection would work equally well of rainbow bodies. And that's a question they need to answer. It's a question I've posed here. I haven't answered it, but they need, I think, to address this question seriously. And to my knowledge, they haven't done so yet. I get wildly speculative here. I say, you know what, Christians haven't believed traditionally that Jesus was the only one to rise from the dead. They have the saints in Matthew 27 rising from the dead. They've taken that literally. They've had the seven sleepers of Ephesus, which some people took um, as, as as history. So, what do you do with it?
Yeah.
Look, is it possible? So you might say, as a Christian, you might say, well, I think some of these rainbow body things happen, but they're not at all like the resurrection of Jesus. Okay, you can make that argument, but somebody needs to make it, because as far as I know, it hasn't been made yet. Or somebody needs to say why all these arguments I use against rainbow bodies, you can't turn around and use against the resurrection stories.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I'm not concluding anything here. I'm just saying, hey guys, let's talk about this.
And it seems like another option that would be open is to say the tomb was empty. So we have there's an explanation, the traditional Christian explanation, God raised Jesus from the dead, the tomb's empty, and these rainbow bodies are legitimately, in this religious context, whatever it is, there's something really happening to these bodies that's causing them. And I could be mistaken about this, but I believe in Craig Keener's Miracles, his 2 volumes on miracles. He gives accounts of what seem like miraculous things happening in other religions, and it seems like maybe Christians don't automatically have to rule those out.
Well, I hope certainly they don't. There is a tradition of attributing pagan miracles either to legend or to Satan. I think that's very ungenerous. All our miracles happen. None of your miracles happened. I also, as a historian, find this a very difficult way to proceed. So I think if you're open to the miraculous in the Bible and you're open to the miraculous in Christian experience throughout the centuries, you can have a very tough time justifying dividing our miracles from everybody else's. My own view is that the rain falls on the just and the unjust, right? And the sun shines on the good and the bad, and good things come to everybody. So why not?
Okay, before we leave the parallels, a couple more questions here about the lessons. So those were some of the lessons regarding rainbow body. Now, as far as lessons from Marian appearances, it seems like the big lesson there is large groups of people over an extended period of time can claim to have seen something that seems totally inexplicable on maybe naturalistic or not very well explained on naturalistic grounds. So that seems like a takeaway for me, but what were lessons there that we can take away for you?
But so what I focused on was Zaytun, and I just claimed that my main claim there was that we can have a lot of knowledge about an event and have no explanation for it. I simply have no explanation. And when people come to the New Testament text, they're always assuming, yeah, I can explain everything because I got God here and God's doing everything. Or I'm a skeptic and I have a rational reductionistic explanation for everything. I actually think there are things in the world that we look at and we just say, what the heck was that? And we need to keep an open mind. So this is in part, that chapter is in part addressed to skeptics to say, I don't think we can explain away everything in easy arguments.
And then the last lesson here from veridical visions. I imagine there's kind of 2 ways this could, I mean, there's plenty of ways it could look, but here's just 2 examples. It seems like a veridical vision. I don't know if you've seen the Star Wars movies. I'm thinking of episode 6 near the end where Darth Vader I believe Obi-Wan and Yoda, they're all standing together, but they're like transparent. But you see their like form. They look like they're there, but they're maybe kind of like ghosts in a way, or spirits or something.
Okay.
So it seems like you could have a vision of something like that and say it was really there, but it's just not physical. Like you know, as you're perceiving it, that's really there, but it's just not physical. And then in other cases, it might look like it's absolutely physical. What are your, in reading the literature on veridical visions and having your own experiences, what are people saying? Like, can they reach out and claim that there's been, they could touch the person, or
Yeah. So this is really important. Apologists tend to assume that if somebody's had a vision of a dead person, that it's something like the stereotypical ghost. And it is not. Most people who see a dead loved one do not use the word ghost. They say, I saw Fred, or I saw Mildred, or Mary, or whatever it is. Not only that, but they are usually not transparent. And this is so hard for people to grasp. I don't have the answer here, but you can find accounts in which people said, my husband, he touched me, he kissed me, he held me. One of them says he lifted me off my feet. I found a couple which said it was just like Jesus in the Gospels. I mean, he was really there and you could touch him. So I don't know what's going on. I really don't. I really don't know what's going on here. But phenomenologically, it is the case that people in our time and place can report a dead person showing up and interacting with them as though they are fully present physically, and then they just pop out, and they're not there anymore. So what the heck is that? I don't really know how to understand this. I can say this, that if you read modern scientists about perception, what they say is that we have, these electromagnetic waves that enter our eyes, and then they get turned into chemicals, and then they electrically go to the back of our skulls where they're upside down, and then somehow we turn these into pictures of the real world. And some of them will say that it looks like we're always projecting a movie, or even real perception is something like a hallucination. Now it's really hard to get your head around all this stuff, and I never have. But my thought, to repeat something I said earlier, was that maybe visions that are veridical aren't that different than seeing the normal world. That is, there's some sort of input, and then our reality, our virtual reality machine, which is what's making this world all the time what it is, it does this with these similar inputs. Don't I want to be humble here. I don't have a clue what's going on. I'm just saying that if you want to make arguments about visions, you should know the data. You should know the phenomenology. You should take it seriously, whether you're a skeptic or an apologist or somebody else. I've found this literature to be utterly fascinating, and I do think that the arguments against the visionary nature of the appearances, I don't think they look as strong once you know this literature well.
that leads really well to this final section. So the final section of the book you call Analysis and Reflections. And again, the question that was driving this was, what is going to be the best fit of an explanation to the data that we have, keeping in mind what we learned from historical critical studies and these parallels. So some apologists have made bad arguments. So we might only have time for just one. So maybe just you can pick one of your choice. What's one that typical argument for the resurrection of Jesus that you hear a lot, but you think that's just not persuasive?
Oh, well, there are any number of them. One of them has to do with the martyrdom of the disciples and the argument that all 12 of them, 12 of the disciples gave their lives for Jesus. I personally don't think we know what happened to most of the disciples or apostles. They just disappear after Acts 1. And I think everything we know about most of them is legend. So first of all, I don't like any arguments which are about the 12 or the apostles. You can argue from the martyrdoms of Paul and Peter and James of Zebedee that they were sincere. I think that's fair enough. But sincerity is not an argument, it seems to me, for the truth of something. People can obviously be sincerely wrong. So I spent some time on that argument and tell you why I don't think it takes you where you want to go. Another argument, and I'll start with this on the apologetical side, is that there are some differences between the Gospels and some tensions, maybe even contradictions, but this proves that they weren't colluding with each other, that they're independent witnesses and therefore reliable in telling the truth. Chrysostom, already back in the 4th century, makes this argument, but the problem with it is, yeah, maybe you can make the case that they're independent of each other. Okay. Although I happen to think Matthew had read Mark and Luke had read Mark and John had probably heard one or more of the synoptics. But even if you grant the argument, there are multiple versions of many legends. There are multiple versions of many rumors. The fact that there are different versions of something doesn't establish the truth of an original, right? So that's just a bad argument. On the other side, bad arguments of skeptics, one of the arguments that you'll find is the opposite of what I just talked about. That is, you will have people like David Friedrich Strauss, who said there are so many differences between the Gospels that we can't trust them here at all. So that's taking the same data and coming to the opposite conclusion, which should be telling you something's wrong here, right? That doesn't work either. It's just the case that if you take any major event and interview multiple eyewitnesses, they'll disagree on all sorts of things. They'll get the gist right? And by the way, the Gospels do agree on the gist. Joseph of Arimathea buried Jesus. The tomb was found empty. He appeared to his disciples later on. They do agree on the gist. So that's a lousy argument. I also think the argument for miracles is just a non-starter because it just begs the question. It's not an argument. But I also give some attention to the question of miracles. And again, I make the case that the world is a really strange place, and I'm not a flat earther or a flatlander. I think the David Humes of the world are just wrong, and I give some reasons why.
We may come back to Hume in near the end here, but okay. So thank you. That was definitely, those are common arguments that are offered. Now, those are common arguments from apologists. Let me ask you this: what are some skeptical arguments against the resurrection of Jesus that you hear a lot, but you think these aren't persuasive?
Okay. Well, so let me just repeat what I said. First of all, I think the argument that miracles don't happen is just a non-starter. That's not an argument. It's just begging the whole question. If you're a skeptic and you want to argue against the resurrection, what you need to do is come up with an alternative scenario that's plausible and makes sense and is far more plausible than any other scenario. Again, I argue against people who think that everything in the world is reducible to modern textbook science. I just think they're misinformed. But again, the people like Strauss who look at the disagreements, that's not a good argument. You can have disagreements about events that happened. So if the apologists say the disagreements prove the truth, and if the skeptics say the disagreements prove this is all false, they're both just wrong, right? They're both developing bad arguments. Just one more. I think it's a bad argument. There was a tomb discovered with some ossuaries earlier in this. Well, it became a news story earlier in this century, and some people think that we've discovered the ossuary in which Jesus was buried. This is the so-called Talpiot tomb, and I have no interest in the details here. It's just that I don't think um, that is true, and I wouldn't appeal to it if I were a skeptic. I wouldn't base anything on the possibility that Jesus is buried or was buried in this tomb that um, we know about. So
For the details, you can look it up. I must have read it incorrectly, or I thought it was Talipot, but it's Talpiot.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. I probably just misread it. So okay, you can look up the details for that. All right. Now here's the interesting part. This was a lot of fun reading this section of the book. So, to you, what is a reasonable skeptical scenario in light of the historical facts and the lessons we learned from the parallels?
Okay. So here's the way I did this. I just said, let's try to be honest. Let's try to play devil's advocate. And the truth is, I wasn't satisfied with any of the skeptical scenarios. So I actually sat down and said, can I come up with a better skeptical scenario? That might seem like an odd thing to do, but I was just trying to be fair with the data. And so I came up with this. If I were a skeptic, this is what I would say. First of all, I would say that Jesus's tomb was empty. And it was empty probably because it was robbed. There actually is a surprising amount of evidence that people robbed tombs for body parts. Magic was rife in the ancient world, and you can find papyri with magical recipes on them that you should use the bone of someone who died violently, and so on. We also know that there were laws against this, and this shows up in literature, the fact that people stole bodies. There's also evidence for this in Palestine. And by the way, there are lots of graves that are marked with curses against people, telling them, God will curse you if you open this tomb and come in and it's not your tomb, and so on. So that's the first thing I would say. And I would say they came in the night, because that's when you do criminal activity. And that's why the door was open, because they were in a hurry. They're not going to turn around and close the door. They just steal the body and run away. So the women show up because they're to mourn, and the tomb is empty. And what do? They're like Mary in John 20. What's happened? But then I would argue, if I were a skeptic, that Mary then hallucinated Jesus, and that she probably put two and two together. The tomb's empty, and I saw him, so he must have risen from the dead. I would then argue that, in accordance with the Gospels, that Jesus had said something about future death and resurrection, and that they took these prophecies and added them to these two facts. And then some other people later on also thought that they saw Jesus. That's a skeptical scenario. That's the best I think that's out there. So that's what I came up with.
And okay, let me jump to this, because it'll just be a natural follow-up. So how do you think apologists would respond to that kind of skeptical scenario?
Well, I think what they would say is it involves some coincidences, right? You have a visionary who hallucinates a newly departed person, and you got a grave stolen at just a body stolen at just the right time, and it happened to in the context of somebody who had looked forward to tribulation and resurrection. So a lot of coincidences. But coincidences happen, right? history is made of them. And the skeptic could easily report, well, I don't know what the odds of this are, but what are the odds of God raising somebody from the dead? Your alternative is just as mathematically long on the odds as mine is. I think that what they would argue beyond that is that there's no evidence that Jesus's tomb was robbed. But I would say if there were robbers, they're never going to come forward. No one's ever going to find out. They're not going to, they would have done it in secret, and that's why it would never have been found out. And apologists would also then say, well, but we have this story of the appearance to the 12 and the appearance to the 500. Those are collective things. I think this gets really complicated, and I'm not really sure how to do this quickly, so I won't even make the attempt. But it turns out that collective visions are their own very tricky subject. And you can go either way with this one if you want to. So what I end up saying is that if you are a skeptic and you have a particular worldview, I think you could live with that scenario. And I actually think it's better than any of the other skeptical scenarios out there. I make it clear that I don't believe this myself. It's not my personal belief. But I am neither in this book an apologist or a skeptic. And at the end of the day, I think your worldview is going to dictate where you come out here. I don't think the evidence is, there are some events in history for which the evidence is simply overwhelming. There was a Second World War. You can't doubt that and be sane. But you can doubt some of the stuff here, right? Anyway, I'll stop there. I played devil's advocate. I thought that would be fair.
That's helpful. It's interesting because, well, somebody could do this. You talked about rainbow bodies, so it could be that Jesus's body shriveled up if this happened. But you don't make use of that in your skeptical scenario. But
no, I don't make use of that at all. No.
Yeah. Okay, so now I thought this was a very, very important point near the end of the book. You say, okay, say the apologists are correct and God raised Jesus from the dead. You argue that not much actually follows from that God raised Jesus from the dead. So can you explain why?
Yeah, now that sounds really bad coming from a Christian, which I profess to be, but I'm trying to make a really significant philosophical and theological point here. I may be wrong, but this is what I think. First of all, if you start out with Jesus rose from the dead or God raised Jesus from the dead, that still leaves you with every question in the book. Should you be a Roman Catholic or a Protestant? Should you be Eastern Orthodox or a Mennonite? Should you be a Baptist or a Presbyterian? Was Athanasius wrong? Was Arius wrong? Who was right? What view should I have about the Bible? What view of inspiration and authority should I have? You can go on. Every single theological question, important question, almost every one of them is not answered by this because the participants in the debate actually agree on this point, but it doesn't cause them to agree on much of anything else. Okay, do you understand that, first of all? Yep. It just seems to be an empirical fact that agreeing upon this doesn't give you everything else. It simply doesn't. Now, the second thing is that you need to look at the sentence, God raised Jesus from the dead. Well, there are two characters in here. The first one is God, and the second one is Jesus. Is the word God, G-O-D, self-explanatory? Do you know what it means? Is there any debate as to the meaning of who God is? What God is? Should I have an apophatic theology? The questions about God, the identity of God, they go on forever, right? Is this the God of the, hellfire fundamentalists? Is the God of the weak-kneed liberals? Which God is this, right? If you know anything about Christian history, you know there are different conceptions of God. If you're an historian like me, you think there are different conceptions of God already in the Bible that So that's the first question. You have to define God. This sentence itself doesn't define God for you. And then the second thing is that Jesus himself, again, if you're a modern person, is not defined. So which Jesus is this? We've had this quest for the historical Jesus going on for 3 centuries. So is this the Jesus of all 4 gospels? Is it the Jesus of the synoptics? Is it the Jesus of one historian's reconstruction? Is it this historian's reconstruction? Does Jesus mean absolutely everything in the gospels? Does it mean most of the things in the gospels? Does it mean the gist of the gospels? So my point here is I don't think God raised from Jesus from the dead is a sort of standalone argument, right? The way I think of it is it's a belief which is within a nexus of beliefs, or it's within a framework, and it gives meaning to the framework, but the framework gives meaning to it. And you can't remove it from the framework and look at it and say, what the heck does this mean? The truth is that there are Tibetan Buddhists who have no trouble saying, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead. He's just another version of rainbow body. There are Hindus who will say, well, Jesus was an avatar. And of course, God raised him from the dead. He's, the Christians' version of Krishna. And they have no trouble with God raised Jesus from the dead. The point would be that you still have to argue as to what this sentence means. The sentence itself doesn't tell you where to go. So you can't isolate it. What you make of it follows from everything else, it seems to me, that you believe. And that also takes you back to the apologist and the skeptic. At the end of the day, the skeptic starts out with a framework in which they put the data, and then they make the sense of the data within that framework, right? They'll derive the data from, or the framework from that data. And I think it's exactly the same with the apologists. They don't really derive their framework from the historical record of the resurrection or from the sentence, God raised Jesus from the dead. There's this, it's simply one factor of many. Now, you can argue as a Christian that if you take it out, the framework is destroyed, or the universe is destroyed. But that is different than saying that it itself is an independent epistemological foundation, or that it dictates everything, that everything else follows from it. So that's the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, I hope to see more discussion on that going forward. I'll emphasize this, and I promise we'll wrap up soon. Thank you so much for being generous with your time here. So some people may think, the resurrection, if God raised Jesus from the dead, then the teachings of Jesus are true. But what you say in the book is, well, what teachings exactly? Are we going with what we can know the historical Jesus said? Or are we going with what the Gospels report that he said? Are we right?
Yeah, well, what Gospels? Which ones? So there's this huge discussion that's been going on for a long time about how much history is in John, and the historical critical schools that I grew up in, they all taught that there's more history in the synoptics than in John's gospel. Now, you may say that doesn't matter theologically, they're all part of the canon, we can preach them all and so on. But if you're thinking historically, I'm one who thinks that the historical Jesus of Nazareth is more faithfully represented in Matthew, Mark, and Luke than he is in John. I see John as more theological, more reflective, as mixing the words of the evangelist with traditions about Jesus in a way that isn't the case with the earlier Gospels. So that raises the question for me: what exactly do we mean by Jesus?
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm not. I mean, I have answers to that question. My point is simply that the sentence, God raised Jesus from the dead, doesn't answer that question for me. I have to figure that out. And again, it's going to be determined by things around it, by the universe in which it's plugged into.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I'm not here to push back really on anything you said. I'll just briefly share my thoughts. And we'll go to questions very quickly. So I'm largely persuaded by the way that Richard Swinburne argues. I actually just interviewed him last week, and but he has this much more filled out picture, like you're talking about. And his whole point is, it's not just any old person that's raised from the dead. It's God incarnate that's raised from the dead. And there's kind of two steps there. Would you expect God to become incarnate? And then if he did become incarnate, what would you expect to happen in his lifetime, his or her lifetime? So I won't get into all that here, but I think that it fills out the picture.
Yeah, but let me interrupt. So Swinburne, to get to his strong case for Jesus being raised from the dead, has to make a number of theological and philosophical moves before he gets there.
Yeah.
And that would be part of my point, that he can't just start here. He actually has to do a bunch of stuff before he can interpret this sentence, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think I'm agreeing with you that it takes this filled out picture to make this meaningful. God raised Jesus from the dead. Yeah. I guess I'm just saying I'm persuaded by the way Swinburne fills out the way he does it. Okay, well,
that's not. Well, I'm not, but that's actually not the subject of my book. So again, my book, for all its length, is I think fairly modest, and I'm not doing the theological task in that book. Swinburne's actually trying to do theology. I'm just saying, okay, theologians, I think it's a little harder than maybe you think it is.
Yeah. Okay. So there were two questions that viewers submitted in advance, and I'll ask you these two, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
So one of my patrons asked, do extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? That is, does a resurrection claim require photo, video, and forensic evidence to be rationally believed?
Okay, so that's a big question that I don't think I can answer satisfactorily, but I can at least begin to answer it. So I don't think the question is absolute. I think, again, it's relative to a framework. So, for example, let's say that tomorrow you call me on the phone and you say, wow, I had a dream last night. And here was the dream. And then I woke up, and then 2 hours later, through no account of my own, everything I dreamed just came to pass. So I had a precognitive dream. What do you think of that? Now, if I were one sort of person, I would say, it's a bunch of supernatural nonsense, balderdash, that's ridiculous. It can't happen. It doesn't fit physics. You can't see the future. I would say, that happened to me once. I had a dream. I saw the future. It happened the next morning. I know it happened. I know it wasn't coincidence. So I'm inclined to think, yeah, why not? So it's where you start that makes evidence extraordinary or not. Now, as weird as this may sound to some people, given my own experience, given my own study, given my conversations with other people, I actually don't think there's anything that weird with Jesus appearing to his disciples after he's dead. That's actually not extraordinary to me. The extraordinary thing is the empty tomb, which is more difficult. And I suppose that's in part what this whole book, from one point of view, is struggling with, right? But half of this isn't a problem for me. It really isn't. So things are relative to your framework. If you have a certain sort of framework, nothing will convince you. I think in the book, I quoted a couple of people who said, if I saw this happen before my eyes, and if, these people, and he named a bunch of important, honorable people, if they all swore that they'd seen it too, I wouldn't believe them because I know it couldn't happen. We are all victims of this. We welcome what fits and we reject what doesn't fit. And we don't have the same framework. So that's how I would begin to approach that. I think it's a relative, evidence is relative to the framework in which you're working.
Okay, I think this is an appropriate question to end with here. To what extent should the Christian base their belief in the resurrection on the analysis of the historical data?
Okay, well, that would take a lot of unpacking. I suppose it would depend on what base means. First of all, I think as a matter of fact, you'd have to hunt long and hard to find any Christians who based their faith on dispassionate research into the historical facts and then saying, gosh, I'm just overwhelmed by the facts. I don't really want to be a Christian, but I'm forced by the evidence to do this. Apologists sometimes tell me that they convert people, but I'm pretty sure that these are people who have other things going on with their lives, that there are other factors. It's not just a purely intellectual decision. So that's the first thing. I'm not sure anybody bases in that sense their faith on historical facts. But here's the problem for Christians. The problem for Christians is if you have this framework of faith and you have a bunch of different beliefs, it may well be that in this universe, the resurrection of Jesus has to be there. That is, you're like Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. If you pull this out, then nothing else works, right? Everything is vain and falls down. But to me, that doesn't mean you have to be able to prove it. All you have to be able to say is that it's not unreasonable to believe this, or the evidence doesn't compel me to disbelieve it. And I think it's fair to say that at the end of my book, you can say that. I actually say at the end of the day that I think the skeptic can stay a skeptic without feeling terrible. But I also say quite clearly that a Christian can look at this and say, yeah, this fits what I believe. There's nothing here to disprove what I think. So again, I don't think this is an epistemological foundation. And biographically, I don't think this is where people start. You may decide doctrinally that you have to have this historically true. But again, I myself think that we can live with it's not unreasonable to think this, as opposed to I've got to be able to prove to dispassionate reason that everybody should believe that. That's a different thing for me.
So I'll say a concluding thought here. Would you, just to build on that, would you say that somebody could look at the historical data and treating it as fairly as they possibly can, trying their best? It's not possible to be totally unbiased, but trying to be as fair with the data as they can. They look at it and they might say, you know what, it's underdeterminative which direction I should go with this data. I'm not sure. I'm not compelled to go the skeptical route, and I'm not compelled to go the maybe traditional explanation route. The data just doesn't force me one way or the other. I'm left kind of maybe in a 50-50 position. Would you say that that's it sounds like you're saying that's a fair assessment.
That's a possible way to be, and then you will make your religious choices or decisions based on other things. That's just the way that's the way it's going to go, and actually that's the way it usually goes. Again, while apologists will tell me that sometimes they'll convert people into crowds, I doubt that that's all that's going on. That is just an intellectual response to the data and saying, gosh, I don't want to believe this at all. It's terrible, but I'm being enforced into it, and I'm going to be pulled in, dragging and kicking. I don't think that's a very common occurrence.
So that's the kind of agnostic position, and you think it seems that's fair. But if somebody became a skeptic on the basis of the historical evidence, would you?
I don't I don't think you would. I think everything again is determined by your framework. And again, if you're a Christian, there's so many other things to think about. So if you had Swinburne on, he didn't just talk about this. He talked about other things. He talked about what was plausible and the probability of God's existence and all this other stuff. There are just a million factors that are involved in making these sorts of decisions. And the historical data surrounding this issue is potentially only one. Even if it's at the center of theology, that doesn't mean it's at the center of every argument for faith.
Yeah. Well, do you have any thoughts you want to end with before we wrap up? I mean, part of that was, but if you wanted to say something else, you may.
I could just add to that. Actually, the book I'm finishing right now, finishing this summer, and which I hope will be out next year, is called The Persistence of Religious Experience. And in that book, I'm not being an historian. I'm talking about ongoing religious experiences and what they mean and trying to think about them within a Christian framework. So that's part of the framework for me, right? It's not this isolated thing here.
Well, I look forward to looking at that book. So thank you very much, Dr. Allison, for coming on. It was a real honor to have you.
Thank you very much. Appreciated being here.
You can check out my interview with Mike Lacona on some different types of objections to the resurrection. And then I also made an animated video that you may want to check out on the
animated video, huh?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.